This is a review of Designing Disney, Imagineering and the Art of the Show. Unfortunately ironic that a book on the subject of design excellence should itself be so amateurish in its design, so it is hard not to cringe a bit when reading/viewing it. But anyway, this edition we're looking at here is the 2008 paperback. It was originally published in 2003 as a hardcover that has quite a different cover to this one, although, as far as I'm aware, the innards are exactly the same. The book's written by Imagineering legend John Hench, who's probably best known for his concept art and design work, both for Disney's films and parks. It's also co-written by Peggy Van Pelt. I'm not really sure who she is or what her contributions to the books are, but her cover bio says that she was at Imagineering for over 30 years, whatever that means. But I imagine, or I hope, she was just there to help John get his ideas on paper, as he was in his mid-90s when this book was written. The book's about 160 pages, which is dangerously close to what I would call the bare minimum for a book on this subject. Unfortunately, it does feel a lot shorter even than that due to having rather large text and images. So it's only got a little over 200 images, which for a book this size is acceptable, though not particularly impressive, though I guess the silver lining of that is you do get to see them in greater detail. It's strange, whenever I see a book on the parks that's written by an Imagineer, especially one as amazing and long-standing as John Hench, my immediate thought is that, oh, this'll be amazing. Who could possibly have more insight and understanding of the parks than the people who actually built them? And in theory, that sounds like it should always hold up. However, in practice, I've found that the Imagineers don't necessarily tend to write books that are any better than outside authors, specifically in terms of text and information. Imagery is a whole other matter, which I think is a little underwhelming considering the unique advantage Imagineers have over outside authors, that they don't take advantage of it as much as they should, and instead typically fall back on presenting very basic information and just sort of sucking Walt's weenie. Perhaps it's because it's such an ingrained part of their everyday lives that they don't necessarily know how to present it to an outside audience, and so end up dumbing it down too much. The main issue with this book is it's just way too much basic design theory and philosophy, just very basic stuff about things like color and mood. The whole book just feels like an exercise in stating the obvious. You already know the majority of the stuff presented in this book just by virtue of having common sense and the most basic understanding of how any sort of holistic design decisions work. And then if on top of that you've already read anything on Imagineering, then there's next to nothing you'll learn from this book. Do you really need another explanation of forced perspective or what a weenie is and stuff like that? I mean, everything about this book suggests that it is for adults, but I really don't understand what sort of person would find any of this information enlightening. Like, who's reading this and saying, wow, you mean people actually move towards visually interesting things? What a revelation. Whoa. They actually design the restaurants to harmonize with the surrounding attractions? John, you're blowing my mind. The whole thing feels like something between an art theory lecture and a promotional pitch to investors. It also feels like 90% of this book's vocabulary is made up of about 50 words and phrases that just get repeated over and over. And consequently, it's a lot of words trying to sound as if they're saying something intelligent, but ultimately saying nothing of value. And so for every topic covered, you'll get a page of blah blah blah. We use color and shape and character to create convincing environments and enhance our guest's story, blah blah blah. And what I've just said there essentially sums up the majority of this book. Then that'll usually be followed by a short specific example or a personal anecdote of how that design idea manifests in the park, which sounds good and often is where you'll find some scarce scraps of interesting information you didn't know, but never enough to counteract all the blah blah stuff. The ratio of general state the obvious text versus specific interesting informational text is just way off. Like I said at the start, this isn't the first Imagineering book to have this problem. A book I've reviewed previously, Walt Disney Imagineering, also took this same approach, although it did it a lot better. And this is what I mean when I say the books by Imagineers tend to be underwhelming in terms of information, because none of them are able to present a book that takes readers beyond the first week of Imagineering 101. It's like they're writing their books in a vacuum, completely unaware that other books on the subject already exist. The other thing about the writing that just really annoyed me and really wore me down was this constant, honestly, it feels like almost every sentence, this constant thing of him presenting an idea that is dead obvious as if it's genius, Disney patented design wisdom. For example, I'm genuinely just going to randomly open up to the middle of the book, middle of this page, middle of this paragraph. Okay, and this is where he's talking about how a ride's vehicle takes guests through the attraction, through the story, similar to how a camera does in film. He writes, "The vehicle's movement determines what guests see and when they see it." Wow, really? We position images in places where guests will most naturally direct their attention and light them for maximum effect, and we devise scene sequences to reveal the stages of the story's emotional journey in a natural, dramatic rhythm. And that there really does represent almost the entire essence of this book, of dressing common sense up as if it's a revelation, as if there's any logical alternative. Like, seriously, in that situation, what was the alternative? Oh, we're going to put all of our imagery in places the guests won't see them, we're not going to light anything properly, and we're going to have the vehicles randomly teleport the guests around the attraction. Again, going back to this idea of Imagineers not necessarily being the best sources of information despite their position, John Hench is not a very good source of information. For example, in the book he tells a story about how the Snow White grotto statues mysteriously and anonymously arrived at Disney, which sounded dubious to me, so I looked it up, and it is a lie. The statues were commissioned by the company, which was a fact that was only discovered after someone went through paperwork belonging to, guess who? John Hench. And in my books, something like that is a real black mark against him, that he thinks it's appropriate in a non-fiction, behind-the-scenes book where people are going to be coming to him, trusting him as a reliable source, to then abuse that trust by purporting a very pointless myth. It's a little insulting, and as a result casts doubt over everything else he says in the book. Now, to be fair, despite these criticisms, I don't mean to sound like the book is a horrible read. Frustrating and disappointing, sure, but like most of the other Imagineer written books, it has this enormous warmth and passion and positivity, which, if nothing else, makes reading the book a little endearing and full of those sort of Disneyland feelings and sort of OG Walt Disney approach to creative challenges, which is always a welcome contrast to the cold terror of modern corporate Disney. And just like the other Walt Disney Imagineering book I mentioned, it does potentially provide some great inspiration for reflecting on how certain design philosophies can be implemented in any sort of field or creative endeavor. Whether or not that's something every reader is going to want from the book is probably divisive. I mean, even though I don't necessarily hate all of this design theory, and I do kind of enjoy it as stimulating food for thought, there's just way too much of it. That's basically all the book is. And I would have much preferred more solid information and specific nuts and bolts discussion on how and why certain things were done. So obviously the text is not very good, but where the book's real strength is in the amazing art it presents, especially the concept art of things that never actually ended up being made. I'd say over 50% of the images are concept art. Without that, I wouldn't recommend this book to anyone, although I still don't think there's enough art to warrant purchasing the book just for that. Unsurprisingly, most of all of the art in the book is John Hench's work, which is really good. But despite the fact that most of the imagery is art, that's not strictly what the text is all about. Instead, it really does have a more whole focus on all aspects of design as it pertains to Imagineering and its many mediums and applications. Also, I should definitely mention the book does seem to be talking about Imagineering design in a general sense, but the focus is definitely on Disneyland. Because there are so many books on the Disney parks, it can be really hard to know how much of the art presented here can also be seen in other books. That's why I value doing these flip-throughs so highly, because you can look through any Disney books you already own and compare it to this book and make a decision based on if you think this book offers enough new art that you don't already have access to. And then also, just to be perfectly clear, in case you're not really paying attention to the flip through, There aren't any behind-the-scenes photos, and if you're looking for photography of the park, it is there, mostly vintage stuff it seems, but not much, nor particularly amazing photos. The art really has to be the main reason you're coming to this book. This book actually gets so many glowing reviews elsewhere. I think it's mostly due to the fact that a lot of folks have this inability to stop salivating, take off their Disney goggles, and actually offer a critique of the book, especially because I've just checked the current secondhand prices for this book, and they are ridiculous. I got this book when it first came out for maybe like $25 or $30, which even at that price I wouldn't end up buying if I had my time again. But for the prices they're asking for on eBay and stuff of $50 to over $100, no way. If you're going to spend that sort of money, you might as well invest it in a much better book. So the question then becomes, okay, what's a better book then? Well, on the one hand, there are so many Disney park related books that it can be very overwhelming deciding what's the best. However, the great flip side of that is, whatever specific park or area of Disney you're interested in, there's almost certainly a book on the subject, which is what I would recommend you try and home in on. But in terms of more general Imagineering, some recommendations that are perhaps comparable to this book would be, in terms of just pure text, my favorite is The Disneyland Story by Sam Genoway. Now, it is just text, which can make it hard to visualize a lot of the more technical aspects, but the fact that it is more technical and more history and factually focused means it picks up a lot of the slack as a great companion to a lot of these more image-heavy books. However, its main limitation is that it mainly focuses on early Disneyland, although that's also probably its great strength. For the person who is mainly interested in this book for the concept art, I would recommend The Art of Disneyland and The Art of Walt Disney World, which are even better than this book on that front, certainly helped by the fact that they don't waste any time or space with text, and also because, as brilliant as John Hench's artwork is, these books draw on a wider range of art from other artists than this book does. However, they are also even more rare and even more expensive than this book. And if you're finding that you're getting a little put off by how expensive all these out-of-print books are, I highly recommend checking out the Imagineering field guides. I think the second ever review I did on this channel was for those, but don't watch that video as it was really bad and I was missing 2 of the books, and yeah. But basically these are very small, cheap books with an amazing variety and quantity of images that are almost completely ruined by the fact that they're printed too small. And although these books do suffer from many of the same problems I've mentioned for this book and other Imagineer written books, I think they're probably the best written and most informative books on Imagineering. And it's such a shame how overlooked they are by many fans, I think just because they're not as big and impressive as many of these other books. But ultimately, for the best all-rounder and direct competitor to this book in terms of having text and amazing images and being specifically focused on Imagineering in a general sense, then you really can't go wrong with Walt Disney Imagineering, a behind-the-dreams look at making the magic real, which I have reviewed, and its sequel, both of which are bigger, better in every sense, and surprisingly cheaper than this John Hench book. I had no idea this review was going to be this long, so let's summarize. We've got a very short, very expensive book on design that is itself somewhat embarrassingly designed. It's a kiddie pool of basic, state-the-obvious information written by an untrustworthy author. But it does have some pretty great artwork, but that's not enough, I'm afraid, and as soon as my Disney Park shelf runs out of space, I can tell you right now, this'll be the first one out the door.